The deafening roar of 100,000 adoring fans vibrates through the heavy mixing console beneath Marcus Lynn's trembling fingertips. As a junior audio technician for Vought International, Marcus lives his life in the shadows of gods, his world defined by decibel meters and feedback loops. Today, the midday sun bakes the asphalt of Vought Plaza, sending waves of heat distorting the air beneath the towering glass monolith of the corporate headquarters. Marcus carefully slides a fader upward, amplifying the orchestral backing track as Homelander hovers majestically above the crowd. The leader of the Seven is a vision of absolute power, his star-spangled cape billowing perfectly in the downdraft of artificial wind machines. Yet, staring at the high-definition monitor in his booth, Marcus feels a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He can see the micro-expressions the crowd misses, the unnatural tightness of the hero's jaw, the dead, predatory emptiness in his eyes, the manufactured smile that looks more like bared teeth. Marcus holds his breath, terrified that a single microphonic squeal or a dropped bass line might draw the blinding, laser-eyed wrath of the world's most powerful being down upon his own fragile, breakable body. Suddenly, the audio feed does not just clip, it ceases to exist. A complete and terrifying vacuum of noise swallows the plaza. The screaming crowd falls instantly mute, the thunderous bass cuts out, and even the ambient rush of the city wind vanishes into a suffocating dead air. Marcus frantically taps his headset, panic spiking as his digital meters freeze. Then a sharp, catastrophic burst of digital static shatters the silence, a sound like 1,000 dial-up modems being violently crushed through a meat grinder. The sky directly above the plaza does not part with the majestic glow of a dimensional portal. Instead, reality itself simply fractures. A massive, jagged tear opens in the atmosphere, replacing the blue sky with aggressively pulsing, perfectly square blocks of neon pink and pitch black. It is a missing texture in the fabric of the universe, an architectural error that physically hurts Marcus's eyes to look at. The deafening rhythmic buzz of an unhandled exception error echoes across the plaza, bringing with it the nauseating smell of burning ozone, melted plastic, and copper. Objects begin to violently purge themselves from the pink and black void, but they do not fall with the grace of gravity. They plummet in jagged, stuttering frames, freezing mid-air for a fraction of a second before snapping downward at impossible speeds. They impact the concrete with a sickening wet crunch, followed immediately by the chaotic, overlapping metallic clatter of heavy objects clipping into one another. It sounds like a broken audio track repeating on an infinite loop. Marcus watches in paralyzed horror as one of the figures twitches and lurches from the crater. It wears the uniform of a foot soldier and a heavy steel helmet, but its eyes are rolled entirely back into its skull, weeping thick, dark blood. The creature's legs are clipped waist-deep into the solid concrete of the plaza, its torso vibrating violently against the pavement with the rapid-fire sound of a jackhammer. It drags its torso forward in a broken, insectile crawl, its jaw unhinging to emit a heavily distorted, deafeningly loud audio file that loops without taking a breath. I am Penis Cupcake. I will eat you. Beside the helmeted crawler, another abomination spasms into existence. It wears the grease-stained overalls of a mechanic, but its head is a grotesque, inverted nightmare. The flesh of its face is entirely upside down, its gaping maw located where its forehead should be. The creature throws its arms wide and unleashes an ear-piercing, reversed scream, a shrieking frequency that physically shatters the reinforced glass of Marcus's sound booth, raining sharp shards down upon his mixing board. High above, Homelander's artificial smile instantly vanishes, replaced by a twitching sneer of pure, unadulterated disgust. This is his stage, his flawless broadcast, being contaminated by grotesque, glitching freaks. With the absolute arrogance of an untouchable deity, Homelander descends. His eyes flare with the terrifying heat of a dying star. Two beams of concentrated scarlet energy erupt from his face, slicing flawlessly through the chest of the helmeted soldier. The blinding wave of heat singes the hair on Marcus's arms from 50 yards away as the creature is instantly bisected, its upper half severed cleanly from its legs. The crowd gasps. Marcus exhales a shaking breath. The god has restored order. But the order is a horrifying lie. The bisected torso does not collapse to the pavement in a charred, smoking heap. Instead, it hovers utterly motionless in the air, defying every fundamental law of physics. A massive, glowing holographic projection of a red error sign flashes violently above its severed spine, emitting a loud, harsh buzzer sound. Before Homelander can even register the anomaly, a screeching, elastic noise rips through the air, the sound of a massive rubber band being pulled to its absolute limit and released. The two halves of the creature magnetically slam back together in a blur of motion, the wound disappearing instantly. The creature locks its arms outward in a rigid, lifeless cross, its body freezing into a stiff T shape. Without moving a single muscle, it slides forward across the rough asphalt. It accelerates unnaturally, ignoring friction and inertia, closing the 50-foot gap to Homelander in a single missing frame of time. For the first time in his life, Marcus sees a flicker of genuine, freezing panic break through Homelander's arrogant mask. The invincible hero reacts on pure instinct, throwing a desperate full-body punch meant to level a skyscraper. It is a concussive shockwave of sheer kinetic force that connects dead center with the creature's face. The impact sounds like a bomb detonating, sending the helmeted freak rocketing backward. The instant the fist connects, the creature's body goes completely limp. It flies through the air with the boneless, horrific elasticity of a rag doll, its neck snapping violently backward so its head touches its own spine. It crashes backward through a massive marble fountain, sending water and stone shrapnel flying into the screaming crowd. But the very millisecond its momentum ceases, the creature snaps perfectly upright. There is no transition of standing up. It is simply lying down in one frame and standing aggressively in the next. It smiles a jagged, manic grin. A rusted military entrenching tool materializes out of thin air into its hand. With a jerky, lag-heavy swing, it brings the flat of the shovel down across Homelander's jaw. The impact does not sound like flesh and bone. It is a cartoonish, hollow, deafening bonk. The god of this world is launched backward like a cannonball, smashing violently through the structural pillars of the Vought lobby, leaving a mist of ruby-red blood hanging in the air. Absolute pandemonium consumes the plaza. Marcus dives under his metal desk, covering his ears and weeping uncontrollably as the rest of the seven charge blindly into a slaughter they cannot possibly comprehend. A-Train blurs into a streak of blue lightning, intending to ram the inverted face mechanic into red mist. But as the speedster closes in, the creature casually stretches its arm, flesh, bone, and fabric, elongating 50 feet in a fraction of a second, completely ignoring three-dimensional space. It grabs A-Train by the throat mid-stride, instantly halting his momentum, and begins slamming the hero repeatedly into the pavement. Every impact is accompanied by the rapid, staccato thud, thud, thud of a collision glitch, cracking A-Train's ribs with sickening ease. Nearby, the deep lets out a high-pitched wail of terror. A massive, hulking brute clutching a heavy minigun laughs a deep, booming laugh that vibrates in Marcus's chest. The giant forces a glowing, ticking explosive down the aquatic hero's throat before casually tossing his flailing body 3 city blocks into the churning waters of the Hudson River. Amidst the carnage, an assassin in a wide-brimmed hat strolls casually through a storm of assault rifle fire from Vought security. The armor-piercing bullets simply pass through his body without registering hits, while he hums a jaunty tune, casually severing limbs with a massive machete, laughing a maniacal, distorted laugh. 3 blocks away, perched high on the rusted fire escape of an abandoned tenement building, William Butcher slowly lowers his military-grade binoculars. The acrid smell of burning Vought merchandise and pulverized concrete wafts up to the rooftop, mixing with the cold city wind. He strikes a match, cupping his scarred hands against the breeze, and lights a crumpled cigarette. He exhales a thick, slow cloud of gray smoke, his dark eyes locked dead onto the impossible massacre unfolding in the plaza below. Beside him, Hughie Campbell is trembling so violently his knees knock against the iron railing. Hughie stammers, choking on his own spit, begging to know what kind of black site experimental soup could possibly treat the seven like cheap, wet tissue paper. Butcher's lips curl upward into a slow, jagged smile. It is a look of absolute, terrifying, predatory satisfaction. He turns to the terrified boy, his voice a low, gravelly rasp over the distant sounds of screaming. He tells Hughie that these aren't Vaught's pampered lab rats. They are a virus, a beautiful, psychotic plague vomiting out from a broken reality. And as Butcher watches Homelander bleed for the first time, he realizes these unkillable, physics-defying abominations are the absolute perfect cure for the disease of gods on Earth. The pulverized dust of Vought Plaza tastes like battery acid and vaporized copper. Marcus Lynn is curled into a tight fetal position beneath the reinforced steel chassis of his shattered mixing console, his hands clamped brutally over his bleeding ears. The world outside his little sanctuary has devolved into an incomprehensible nightmare of sound and broken geometry. He used to lay awake at night paralyzed by the thought of Homelander catching him making a minor acoustic mistake, terrified of the cold, calculating perfection of a flawless god. But the sounds echoing across the plaza right now are infinitely worse because they possess no logic, no motive, and no physical boundary. He hears the horrifying, rapid-fire, metallic clatter of a human body clipping violently against a solid marble pillar, the audio track repeating at 50 frames per second. He hears the sickening, wet squelch of Vought security guards being completely disassembled by entities that do not breathe, do not bleed, and do not care about the laws of mass. Marcus's chest heaves with shallow, phantom breaths. His paralyzing fear of a perfect, wrathful deity has been entirely eclipsed by the suffocating, mind-breaking terror of pure, unfiltered irrationality. A sudden, deafening roar of diesel engines vibrates through the floorboards as Vaught's elite tactical response units pour into the plaza. Heavily armored personnel carriers smash through the perimeter barricades, deploying dozens of black-clad mercenaries armed with military-grade automatic weapons. The air is instantly shredded by the thunderous overlapping staccato of heavy machine gun fire, a desperate attempt by humanity to restore order through overwhelming ballistic force. Marcus risks a terrified glance over the jagged edge of his ruined desk. The mercenaries are pouring thousands of depleted uranium rounds into the towering, inverted-faced monstrosity and the helmeted foot soldier, but the bullets simply vanish upon impact, swallowed by invisible hitboxes, producing nothing but hollow, cartoonish metallic pinging noises. Then the horror escalates. The giant brute with the minigun points a thick, gloved finger at a charging armored vehicle. Without a sound, without a flash of blinding light, a massive rusted shipping container abruptly phases into existence 10 feet above the truck. It drops with a catastrophic, earth-shaking crunch, flattening the heavily armored transport and its occupants into a paper-thin sheet of twisted, bleeding metal. It is not magic. It is a brutal, remorseless manipulation of the world's underlying source code. A choked, gurgling scream pierces through the relentless gunfire, freezing the blood in Marcus's veins. 10 yards away, pinned beneath a massive slab of shattered glass and twisted metal from the lobby's collapsed overhang, is Sarah, a 20-year-old marketing intern he had shared coffee with just 3 hours ago. Her eyes are wide with an animalistic, uncomprehending terror as the helmeted entity, Penis Cupcake, begins to slide toward her. Its body is entirely rigid, locked in a stiff cross shape, hovering 2 inches above the pavement and moving without taking a single step. Marcus's mind screams at him to stay hidden, to let the monsters have her, to survive at all costs. But the absolute wrongness of the creature, the sheer violation of reality it represents, snaps something deep within his core. The passive, terrified audio technician vanishes. Trembling uncontrollably, Marcus grabs a heavy, solid steel microphone stand from the wreckage of his booth. He scrambles across the debris-strewn floor, moving with a desperate, frantic energy. He wedges the cold steel rod beneath the slab, pinning Sarah's leg, straining his muscles until he tastes copper blood in his mouth. With a sickening scrape, the concrete shifts just enough. He hauls her out, dragging her bleeding body behind a reinforced concrete barricade just as the rigid entity slides past them, its distorted audio loop rattling their teeth. Before Marcus can even attempt to bandage Sarah's crushed leg, the ground beneath them heaves violently. A deafening sonic boom shatters every remaining window within a 5-block radius, sending a shower of lethal glass blades raining down upon the plaza. From the smoking, collapsed ruins of the Vought lobby, a figure erupts into the sky. It is Homelander, but he is completely unrecognizable. His pristine, star-spangled cape is shredded into charred, smoking ribbons. His perfectly coiffed golden hair is matted with his own blood, and his face is contorted into a mask of absolute psychotic fury. The god has been made to bleed, and his mind is rapidly fracturing under the impossible reality of his own vulnerability. He does not offer a reassuring smile to the cameras or a speech of salvation to the dying guards. He simply tilts his head back and unleashes a primal, ear-splitting scream of pure, infantile rage that distorts the very air around him. His eyes ignite with a blinding, apocalyptic scarlet light. 2 massive, uncontrolled beams of searing thermal energy sweep indiscriminately across the plaza in a wide, erratic arc. He is no longer aiming, he is attempting to glass the entire square, trying to erase his humiliation by erasing everything in his sight. The heat vision cuts a devastating, blinding swath through the chaotic battlefield. It effortlessly slices a remaining Vought, a PC, entirely in half, ignites the surrounding decorative trees into towering pillars of fire, and bisects 3 screaming mercenaries who were unfortunate enough to be in the crossfire. The twin lasers slam directly into the chest of the inverted-faced mechanic, Vagineer. The sheer kinetic and thermal force of the attack buries the creature deep into the asphalt, melting the ground around it into a pool of glowing orange slag. For a single, breathless second, Marcus thinks the nightmare might actually be over, that raw power has triumphed over the glitch. But the universe's error immediately answers back. The Vagineer lets out a garbled, reversed screech that completely defies the laws of acoustics, hurting Marcus's brain as much as his ears. Instantly, the gravity within a 100-foot radius of the crater ceases to exist. Massive chunks of concrete, burning vehicles, and the severed halves of mercenaries begin to float lazily upward into the sky. Homelander's flight path is completely destabilized by the sudden, localized shift in physics. He spirals violently out of control, screaming as he smashes face first into the glass facade of his own tower with a sickening, heavy thud. The localized zero-gravity field catches Marcus and Sarah off guard. They are lifted abruptly off the ground, tumbling helplessly through a chaotic constellation of floating, burning debris and suspended, spherical droplets of human blood. Marcus frantically paddles his arms through the empty air, his fingers desperately seeking purchase. He feels the intense, radiating heat of a floating, burning tire as it drifts mere inches from his face, threatening to scorch his skin. Below them, the assassin in the wide-brimmed hat leaps hundreds of feet into the air with a single, impossible lag-heavy bound, entirely ignoring the altered gravitational pull. The assassin swings his massive machete, effortlessly cleaving a floating Vought News helicopter in two before landing gracefully on the side of a skyscraper, standing completely perpendicular to the ground as if it were a flat floor. Marcus reaches out blindly, his hand wrapping tightly around a dangling, heavy-duty fiber-optic cable extending from his ruined sound booth. With a massive surge of adrenaline, he pulls himself and the screaming intern out of the gravity anomaly's radius, crashing hard onto the stable, solid pavement of a narrow side alley. His eardrums are ringing with a piercing, high-pitched tinnitus, a permanent physical reminder of the sheer volume of reality tearing itself apart. High above the absolute madness, perched safely on his rusted vantage point overlooking the plaza, Billy Butcher watches the god of this world thrash like a helpless, tantrum-throwing child. The sight of Homelander completely losing control, burning his own men to ash, and crashing clumsily into his own monument of vanity fills Butcher with a dark, deeply intoxicating euphoria. He slowly lowers his military binoculars and spits over the edge of the roof into the abyss. Hughie is frantically pacing behind him, clutching his hair in his hands, pleading that they need to evacuate the city immediately, warning that whatever this terrifying digital virus is, it will consume all of New York before the sun sets. But Butcher moves with terrifying speed, grabbing the younger man by the collar and slamming him hard against the brick chimney. His eyes are wide, burning with a reckless, borderline suicidal clarity. He growls in a low, dangerous register that they aren't running anywhere. With Vaught's entire security grid completely focused on the impossible massacre out front, the impenetrable internal defenses of the tower are entirely exposed. Butcher sees an unprecedented opportunity not just to watch the gods fall, but to break into the sanctuary, raid their darkest, most highly guarded secrets, and ensure that when the dust finally settles, Vought International is nothing but a horrific footnote in a history book. They are going in. Back in the suffocating darkness of the alleyway, Marcus violently drags Sarah toward the darkened entrance of the subterranean subway system, his lungs burning like fire with every labored breath. As he casts one final terrified glance over his shoulder at the burning plaza, he realizes the true apocalyptic scale of the threat facing the planet. The entities are no longer just fighting, they are proliferating. The hulking brute with the minigun tosses a strange, glowing, pixelated sandwich onto the ground. Instantly, another identical, massive brute violently clips into existence right beside it, letting out the exact same booming, distorted audio laugh. The helmeted soldier begins convulsing on the pavement, and with a series of sharp digital popping noises, half a dozen identical clones spawn in a circle around him, all rigidly T-posing and beginning to slide outward into the wider streets of Manhattan. The sky above Vought Tower begins to flicker rapidly, the natural blue atmosphere constantly fighting a losing battle against the invasive, expanding, missing texture squares of bright pink and pitch black. The fundamental physical laws of the universe are being actively overwritten, rewritten, and corrupted by a sentient, malicious code that views humanity not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a minor, easily erasable background prop taking up memory space. Marcus finally drags Sarah down the harsh concrete steps into the suffocating, damp darkness of the subway station. The heavy steel fire doors slam shut behind them, cutting off the blinding, chaotic light of the burning plaza, but doing absolutely nothing to muffle the relentless, distorted sounds of the slaughter happening above. He collapses against the cold, grimy, tiled wall, his trembling hands smeared completely with her blood and his own. His heart hammers against his ribs like a trapped, panicked bird. The fundamental pillar of his reality, the terrifying but absolute certainty that Vought and its pantheon of gods controlled the world, has been entirely obliterated, replaced by a deep, hollow, existential dread of a universe that is fundamentally broken at its core. He has permanently lost the comforting illusion of safety, his entire worldview shattered into irrecoverable pieces by the sight of physics itself crumbling. The heavy, stagnant silence of the underground tunnel is a lie, a temporary and fragile reprieve. He knows with terrifying absolute certainty that they cannot stay hidden down here in the dark. The infection is rapidly multiplying, bleeding its way into the arterial streets of the city above, and Homelander's psychotic, desperate escalation guarantees that if the glitches do not completely erase them, the panicked, flailing wrath of the world's most powerful man undoubtedly will. The suffocating darkness of the 34th Street Penn Station subway tunnel offers no genuine sanctuary, only a temporary claustrophobic illusion of safety. Marcus Lynn presses his trembling back against the grimy, freezing subway tiles, his ragged breathing echoing far too loudly in the subterranean silence. Beside him, Sarah lets out a muffled, agonizing whimper, her hands desperately clutching her shattered, bloody leg. The faint emergency lights flicker overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that seem to dance with malevolent intent. But it is not the darkness that terrifies Marcus, it is the sound. Down here, stripped of the overwhelming visual chaos of the surface, his audio-trained brain becomes hyper-aware of the acoustic nightmare bleeding through the concrete ceiling. He can hear the low-frequency rumble of Vought Tower's structural integrity failing, a deep, resonant groaning of steel and glass giving way to impossible physics. Worse still are the localized auditory anomalies, sharp, high-pitched synthetic squeals, like a corrupted MP3 file skipping on a broken hard drive, echoing down the empty subway tubes. These sounds do not bounce off the curved walls naturally. They travel in jarring, instantaneous jumps, skipping physical space entirely. Marcus squeezes his eyes shut, trying to isolate the frequencies, treating the chaotic soundscape of the dying city like a massive, corrupted mixing console. He realizes with a sickening drop in his stomach that the audio glitches are a warning system, a precursor to the physical tearing of reality. A sudden deafening burst of white noise erupts from the northern tunnel, violently rattling the metal grates beneath their feet. It sounds like 100 radios simultaneously tuning to static at maximum volume. Marcus throws himself over Sarah, shielding her head as the very fabric of the tunnel wall 50 yards away simply ceases to exist. There is no explosion, no cloud of dust. One moment there is solid, reinforced concrete. The next, a perfectly rectangular void of aggressively flashing pink and black squares replaces a 20-foot section of the tunnel. The air pressure in the station drops instantly, pulling loose trash and debris toward the missing texture with a localized artificial vacuum effect. The infection is not contained to the surface. It is eating its way down, devouring the architectural bones of Manhattan, overwriting the subterranean arteries of the city with dead code. A deep, unnatural vibration begins to hum through the heavy steel rails, but it is entirely devoid of the rhythmic clatter of an approaching train. Instead, it is a single, sustained, synthetic bass note that physically hurts Marcus's teeth. Out of the darkness of the southern tunnel, a commuter train violently clips into view. It is not traveling on the tracks. It is hovering 2 feet in the air, its heavy metallic chassis intersecting smoothly through the solid concrete pillars without slowing down. The train itself is a horrifying amalgamation of broken assets. Half of the passenger cars are stretched and distorted like melting taffy, their windows elongated into infinite jagged streaks of light. Inside, the commuters are frozen in permanent rigid T-poses, their faces locked in terrifying, unblinking smiles, while their bodies overlap and fuse into one another. A cacophony of overlapping, pitch-shifted human screams blares from the train's PA system, a nightmarish audio loop of sheer agony. The ghostly, glitching locomotive slides through the station platform, phasing directly through the ticket booths and load-bearing walls, leaving behind a trail of floating pixelated sparks and the nauseating scent of burning motherboards. High above the subterranean nightmare, the pristine, heavily fortified corridors of Vought International's executive levels have become a surreal landscape of corporate opulence and digital decay. William Butcher kicks open the heavy oak doors of the central security hub, his heavy combat boots crunching over the shattered glass of a $1 million chandelier. The room, once the impregnable nervous system of the most powerful corporation on Earth, is now a flickering, strobe-lit tomb. The massive wall of surveillance monitors is displaying a unified, terrifying image, an endless sea of floating red error text masking the slaughter outside. Hughie stumbles in behind Butcher, his face pale as a sheet, his eyes frantically darting at the walls. The mahogany paneling is periodically vanishing, replaced by void-like patches of the skybox outside. Butcher does not waste a single second marveling at the apocalypse. His focus is absolute, ruthless, and chillingly pragmatic. He strides over the violently twitching, ragdolled corpse of a heavily armored Vought elite guard, whose limbs are vibrating rapidly against a desk corner. Butcher shoves the corpse aside, jacking a decrypted flash drive into the primary mainframe, utterly determined to bleed Vaught's darkest secrets dry while the gods are busy fighting the glitch. Hughie violently dry heaves into a designer wastebasket, his fragile grip on reality slipping with every unnatural flicker of the fluorescent lights. He begs Butcher to hurry, his voice cracking an octave higher as he points a trembling finger at the hallway. A deep, heavily distorted Russian voice is echoing up the elevator shaft, accompanied by the impossibly fast, looping sound of a minigun barrel spinning up, stopping, and spinning up again in a fraction of a second. Butcher merely grunts, his eyes locked on the downloading progress bar. He casually draws a massive, high-caliber revolver from his trench coat and aims it directly at the reinforced elevator doors without looking away from the screen. He tells Hughie with cold, terrifying calm that the fear currently paralyzing the world is the exact same fear Vought has used to control humanity for decades. Butcher welcomes the chaos. He embraces the broken physics. To him, the complete annihilation of the established order is the only surgical tool sharp enough to excise the cancer of Compound 5 from the planet. The download completes with a soft chime. Butcher snatches the drive, a feral grin spreading across his face, completely indifferent to the reality-breaking monstrosities rapidly ascending the shaft to tear them apart. Outside, the atmosphere of New York City is boiling. Homelander is entirely consumed by a blinding, apocalyptic psychosis. He floats 50 feet above the ruined plaza, his chest heaving, his face covered in the blood of his own tactical teams. The god cannot process failure. He cannot comprehend an enemy that does not fear him, does not bleed, and cannot be intimidated. If he cannot punch the glitches into submission, he will simply erase the canvas they are drawn on. Homelander lets out a guttural, inhuman roar, his eyes flaring with the heat of a supernova. He unleashes a sustained maximum intensity beam of raw thermal energy directly downward into the center of the asphalt plaza. He is not targeting the entities anymore. He is attempting to melt the Earth's crust itself, trying to cauterize the infection by turning the entire city block into a bubbling crater of liquid magma. The sheer temperature instantly vaporizes the remaining armored vehicles, flash boiling the water in the subterranean pipes and sending massive geysers of superheated steam erupting through the street grates. The asphalt bubbles, turns glowing cherry red, and collapses inward, creating a terrifying, localized sinkhole of molten destruction. Deep below, in the suffocating darkness of the subway station, the ceiling above Marcus and Sarah begins to groan with catastrophic stress. The temperature in the tunnel spikes drastically, transforming the damp, freezing air into a suffocating, arid oven. Marcus watches in absolute paralyzed horror as a massive circular section of the concrete ceiling begins to glow a dull, furious orange. Drops of glowing, liquid slag begin to rain down upon the tracks, burning, searing, hissing holes completely through the heavy steel rails. The ambient sound of the glitches is temporarily drowned out by the deafening, continuous roar of Homelander's heat vision boring through the bedrock of the city. Marcus realizes with crystal clarity that the golden god of humanity has completely abandoned them. The protector of the world has decided that the entire quarantine zone, including every terrified, trapped civilian hiding in the dark, is an acceptable casualty in his desperate, psychotic bid to maintain his illusion of supremacy. They are trapped between the incomprehensible, physics-defying monsters invading from below and the raw, indiscriminate, world-ending wrath of a petulant god burning the sky from above. As Marcus desperately hoists Sarah over his shoulder, ignoring the searing pain in his muscles, a new, entirely different audio cue freezes the blood in his veins. It is a jaunty, cheerful whistling tune, perfectly crisp and clear, contrasting violently with the heavy, distorted ambient noise of the dying city. From the flickering shadows of the adjacent passenger platform, a figure casually phases through a solid structural pillar. It is the assassin in the wide-brimmed hat, the Christian brutal sniper. He is entirely untouched by the heat, the gravity anomalies, or the collapsing infrastructure. He holds a massive rust-stained machete in one hand, dragging the tip lazily along the tiled wall. Instead of a scrape, the blade produces a loud, looping, metallic clang sound that plays every half-second without fail. The entity stops, his head snapping toward Marcus and Sarah with robotic, mechanical precision. There is no fluid movement. His head simply faces forward in one frame and faces them in the next. The cheerful whistling abruptly cuts out, replaced by a low, heavily distorted, demonic laugh. The creature raises the machete, his body vibrating with a malicious, suppressed energy, preparing to close the distance in a single, impossible skip of time. Marcus's instincts, honed by thousands of hours of manipulating soundscapes, take over completely. He cannot fight a being that ignores the laws of motion, but he knows how to manipulate audio. He drops Sarah gently behind a thick steel turnstile and grabs a heavy metal trash can lid. With a desperate, adrenaline-fueled heave, he hurls the lid like a discus straight down the opposite tunnel into the darkness. It crashes against the rails with a deafening, echoing clatter. The sound bounces violently off the curved walls, creating a complex, overlapping echo chamber. The Christian brutal sniper's head snaps instantly toward the noise, its programming prioritizing the loudest, most sudden acoustic trigger in its immediate environment. The entity phases completely out of existence, leaving behind a brief, ghostly afterimage, and reappears instantly 300 yards down the wrong tunnel, violently hacking at the empty space where the sound originated. Marcus does not hesitate. He scoops Sarah up in a brutal fireman's carry, ignoring her screams of pain, and plunges blindly into the dark, sweltering service corridor, leading away from the glowing, melting ceiling. The service corridor is a claustrophobic nightmare of exposed pipes and flickering emergency bulbs, but the physical reality here is rapidly degrading. As Marcus stumbles forward, his heavy boots hit the concrete, but the sound does not match the impact. He hears his footsteps echoing a full second after his foot strikes the ground, an agonizing, disorienting audio-visual desync. The walls around them are no longer solid brick. They are becoming translucent, revealing an endless, terrifying expanse of completely featureless, flat gray emptiness beyond the boundary of the tunnel. It is the edge of the map, the absolute limit of rendered space. Marcus realizes that if he missteps, if he accidentally clips his shoulder through one of the fading walls, they will fall infinitely into the gray void below the world. He has to navigate a narrow, rapidly shrinking pathway of solid geometry, carrying a bleeding woman, while the temperature continues to rise to lethal levels from the molten ceiling above. Every step is an agonizing calculation, a desperate bet against the unraveling fabric of the universe, trusting his eyes to find the solid textures while his ears are constantly bombarded by delayed, lagging audio feedback. Sarah's body goes terrifyingly limp over Marcus's shoulder, her breathing reduced to a shallow, wet rattle. The blood loss and the sheer, overwhelming trauma of the shifting reality are shutting her organs down. Marcus collapses against a heavy, reinforced steel fire door, sliding down to the trembling floor, gasping for the superheated thin air. He looks at his hands, slick with her blood, and feels a profound, crushing weight of absolute insignificance settle into his bones. His entire life was built on ensuring perfect broadcasts, delivering flawless audio for perfect, indestructible heroes. Now he realizes that the perfection was always a thin, fragile veneer over a chaotic, indifferent universe. The gods he feared are just flesh and blood, prone to psychotic tantrums, currently burning the world they swore to protect. And the new masters of this reality are mindless, glitching abominations that view human life as a negligible line of code to be deleted. He presses his forehead against Sarah's clammy skin, tears cutting clean lines through the concrete dust on his face, mourning not just her fading life, but the total, irrevocable death of the world's sanity. Marcus Lynn's fundamental belief in order, in physics, and in the protection of the powerful has been permanently, violently eradicated. He sits in the stifling, unnatural heat of the corrupted tunnel, listening to the delayed, echoing drips of Homelander's molten slag eating through the ceiling behind them, and the distant, distorted laughter of the glitching entities prowling the dark. Sarah's leg is beyond conventional medical repair. The very structure of her bones has been subjected to microscopic spatial anomalies, twisting the marrow in ways no surgeon could ever fix. The safety of the underground is a complete myth. The world is dissolving from the inside out, and the surface is a burning, glassed wasteland created by a terrified superhero. There is no hiding from a threat that deletes the walls themselves. To remain in the suffocating dark is to be quietly erased from existence. With a cold, terrifying resolve hardening in his chest, Marcus realizes their only desperate, microscopic chance of survival lies not in running away, but in ascending back into the apocalyptic heart of the Vought Tower, searching for a place where the source code of reality might still hold firm. The heavy steel door to the sub-level 4 maintenance stairwell groans against its reinforced hinges, the sound warping violently into a low bitrate, deafening digital screech as Marcus Lynn forces it open with his shoulder. He drags Sarah's limp, rapidly cooling body across the threshold, his muscles screaming under the dead weight and the sheer adrenaline of sheer survival. The air inside the vertical stairwell is stagnant and suffocating, smelling sharply of exposed copper wire, ozone, and the sterile metallic tang of a massive electrical fire. But it is the visual geometry of the escape route that makes Marcus deeply nauseous. The concrete steps are no longer entirely solid. Every third stair flickers violently, alternating between poured cement and the aggressive, pulsing pink and black checkerboard pattern of a missing texture file. Marcus has to time his footfalls perfectly, his audio engineer brain syncing to the rhythmic, buzzing hum of the visual glitch to avoid stepping completely into the void. He feels the terrifying, icy draft of absolute nothingness licking at his ankles whenever his boot hovers too close to an unrendered step. He adjusts Sarah over his back, her blood soaking through his Vought-issued polo shirt. Her shattered leg is no longer just broken. The flesh is actively clipping into itself, producing a sickening, rapid-fire, wet slapping sound that echoes endlessly up the dark, spiraling concrete shaft. With every grueling flight of stairs Marcus conquers, the acoustic environment of the tower degrades further into an incomprehensible nightmare. The natural, expected reverb of the enclosed concrete shaft is entirely gone, replaced by a flat, deadened audio space where sounds simply drop to absolute zero immediately after being made. He hears his own ragged, desperate breathing but it sounds exactly like it is being recorded on a cheap microphone inside a heavily padded isolation room, devoid of any natural acoustic bounce. Then the spatial audio completely shatters. Marcus hears the booming, heavily distorted laughter of the minigun-wielding giant, the Heavy, but it does not come from the floor below or the floor above. The sound originates directly inside his own inner ear, a deafening, localized pressure wave that sends a spike of pure, blinding agony through his skull. He stumbles blindly, slamming his shoulder hard against the painted cinderblock wall to catch his balance. The wall immediately yields with the wet, synthetic, squelching sound of a collision error. His shoulder sinks 2 inches directly into the solid brick before the physics engine of the universe violently ejects him backward. He crashes onto the metal landing, clutching Sarah desperately to his chest, terrified that a single wrong move will cause the building's architecture to swallow them whole and permanently delete them from the physical plane. Marcus kicks open the heavy fire door to Level 12, Vaught's experimental biological research wing, desperately seeking a medical trauma kit, a working emergency elevator, or just a single room with solid, uncorrupted floors. The scene stretching out before him is a masterpiece of abstract technological butchery. The pristine, glaringly white corporate corridors are painted with vast quantities of arterial red, but the blood does not pool naturally on the ground. It hovers in jagged, two-dimensional geometric splatters, a few inches above the linoleum, casting absolutely no shadows under the flickering lights. The overhead fluorescent panels are strobing at an irregular, seizure-inducing frequency, accompanied by the high-pitched, whining squeal of a failing digital capacitor. The silence in this sector is heavy, oppressive, and utterly wrong. Marcus lays Sarah gently against a marble reception desk, her breathing now reduced to a terrifyingly shallow mechanical rattle. He creeps cautiously down the main arterial hallway, his boots sticking to localized, invisible patches of altered gravity. He can hear a rhythmic, wet thumping sound, echoing heavily from the primary observation lab at the end of the corridor. It sounds exactly like a heavy sack of wet meat being repeatedly swung against reinforced glass, perfectly timed to a relentless 60 beats per minute metronome. Marcus presses his back against the cool steel of the doorframe, his heart hammering against his ribs, cautiously peering into the shattered observation lab. Inside, the silent, highly lethal assassin of the Seven, Black Noir, is locked in a horrifying, completely one-sided engagement. Noir is an unparalleled master of martial arts, a being of deeply enhanced strength and flawless reflexes, but his physical prowess is utterly useless against an enemy that actively disobeys the fundamental laws of kinetic energy. His opponent is a scout, a wiry, twitchy figure in a baseball cap and headset, but his limbs are impossibly elongated, his arms dragging on the floor like a grotesque, mutated primate. The scout is moving at a frame rate completely detached from reality, teleporting short, jagged distances with a sharp, static popping noise. Noir drives a heavy, vibranium-laced combat knife directly into the center of the scout's chest. The massive blade goes in all the way to the hilt, but there is no blood, no kinetic impact, and absolutely no reaction from the creature. Instead, a cartoonish, glowing green -195 floats lazily into the air above the creature's head. The scout emits a garbled, hyper-fast audio clip, "Need a dispenser here," before casually swinging a heavily dented aluminum baseball bat. The bat connects directly with Noir's heavily armored carbon fiber helmet. The resulting sound is not the sickening crunch of composite armor or the fatal crack of bone. It is a hollow, resonant metallic ping that echoes with absolute impossible acoustic clarity, completely out of place in the muffled, bloody room. The cartoonish impact does not just break the legendary assassin's neck, it violently shatters his localized physics. The terrifyingly silent soup is instantly stripped of all muscular tension and skeletal rigidity. He instantly becomes a boneless physics engine ragdoll. He flies backward across the room at 300 miles per hour, his limbs flailing and spinning with an impossible rubbery elasticity. He slams back first into the reinforced plasteel observation window, but he does not bounce off the glass. His body violently clips halfway through the solid, bulletproof barrier. Noir's upper torso is permanently trapped on the outside of the glass, his legs dangling uselessly on the inside, his entire body vibrating rapidly against the window with a deafening, continuous clatter as the universe desperately, endlessly, tries to resolve two physical objects occupying the exact same space. The localized friction generates immense immediate heat, filling the lab with the suffocating stench of burning Kevlar and roasting flesh. The glitching scout simply T-poses, slides smoothly over the linoleum without moving its legs, and phases directly through the solid concrete wall, vanishing entirely into the digital ether. Marcus frantically backs away from the door, his trembling hands clamped hard over his mouth to stifle a scream, his mind completely rejecting the horrifying sensory data it is being forced to process. He scrambles back down the bloody corridor to the reception desk, where Sarah lies in the flickering shadows. Her physical condition has rapidly degraded past the point of any biological understanding or medical intervention. The spatial anomaly that began in her shattered leg has aggressively crawled upward, consuming her torso. Her right hip and lower abdomen are beginning to actively pixelate, the edges of her flesh blurring into the surrounding air like a heavily corrupted low-resolution image file. She reaches out with a trembling hand, grabbing Marcus's wrist with a terrifying, frantic strength. When she finally speaks, her voice does not originate from her moving lips. The audio plays from an unseen speaker mounted somewhere on the ceiling, heavily compressed and heavily laced with harsh digital static. She begs him to make the pain stop, telling him in a flat, digitized monotone that she can feel her individual atoms being sorted into system folders, that she is being actively unwritten from the world. Marcus is completely paralyzed by the sheer, profound horror of a death that is not organic, but structural. The glitches are not just killing the employees of Vought, they are permanently deleting their fundamental code, erasing their very right to exist within the universe. The true cost of Homelander's failure is not just collateral civilian damage, it is the total, irreversible unraveling of the human form. A cold, heavy cylinder of metallic steel suddenly presses hard against the base of Marcus's skull, snapping him violently out of his paralyzing shock. The sharp, mechanical click of a heavy revolver's hammer being pulled back cuts sharply through the ambient electrical whine of the dying corridor. A low, gravelly voice rumbles from the shadows directly behind him. "Don't twitch a single muscle, mate, or I'll paint this lovely fake wall with what's left of your brains." Marcus freezes instantly, his hands slowly rising into the air as the cold sweat pours down his neck. William Butcher steps smoothly into his peripheral vision, his dark leather trench coat heavily stained with pulverized drywall dust, a terrifying, predatory smirk plastered across his bearded face. Hughie Campbell edges cautiously around the marble desk, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror as he spots Sarah's rapidly pixelating body. Hughie violently dry heaves, clamping a shaking hand over his mouth, horrified by the digital leprosy slowly consuming the young intern. Butcher keeps the massive, high-caliber gun trained squarely on the center of Marcus's forehead, his cold, calculating eyes flicking downward to the Vought corporate ID badge dangling from Marcus's lanyard. Butcher reads the title, Senior Audio-Visual Architect, Internal Broadcast Systems, and his cynical smirk widens into a genuine, terrifyingly wide smile. Butcher lowers the heavy weapon just a fraction of an inch, realizing that the terrified, blood-soaked man trembling before him is unwittingly holding the absolute master keys to the tower's entire nervous system. Butcher smoothly crouches down to Marcus's eye level, completely ignoring the horrific, rapid-fire vibrating sounds coming from the dead superhero trapped in the glass down the hall. He speaks with a cold, terrifying clarity that slices cleanly through Marcus's rising panic. Butcher tells Marcus that the golden gods outside are currently busy melting the pavement in a blind rage, completely and utterly impotent against a digital virus they cannot punch or laser into submission. He gestures upward to the ceiling with the barrel of his gun, explaining that the infection is localized, actively drawing its rendering power from the massive, centralized server farms located on the 99th floor of this very building. Butcher taps his coat pocket. He has the stolen decryption drives, but Marcus has the architectural map, the acoustic bypass codes, and the highest level system clearance. It is a brutal, violently calculated transaction. Butcher explicitly states he does not care about saving the city or the people in it. His singular goal is to hijack the Vought master broadcast array, forcefully bypassing the glitch, to broadcast the corporation's darkest, most horrifying secrets across every single surviving screen on the planet before the world completely unrenders. Marcus stares deeply into the eyes of a known terrorist, a man who has dedicated his entire miserable life to butchering soups. But as Marcus looks back at Sarah, realizing Vaught's flawless heroes left them down in the dark tunnels to be quietly deleted, a cold, intensely bitter hatred takes permanent root in his chest. The gods have failed humanity. The terrorist standing before him is his only viable way up. Hughie, driven by a desperate, panicked need to know if the outside world still holds any semblance of sanity, wanders unsteadily toward the massive, floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass windows of the executive lounge adjacent to the corridor. He wipes away the thick condensation and dried blood spray with his sleeve, peering desperately out into the Manhattan skyline. He lets out a strangled, breathless sob, his knees buckling beneath him. Marcus and Butcher turn sharply to look at the glass. The vibrant, sprawling city of New York is entirely gone. The entire horizon, the bustling streets below, the sky above, everything beyond a strict 3-block radius of Vought Tower has been completely and utterly erased. In its place is an infinite, flat, perfectly uniform gray void that stretches into agonizing eternity. Floating dead in the center of the massive, featureless gray expanse, rendered in gigantic, glowing red Arial font that hurts the eyes to perceive, are the words, "Node graph out of date, rebuilding." The universe has hit a hard, insurmountable boundary. They are entirely trapped inside a quarantined, failing server map that is rapidly running out of memory. There is no military rescue coming from Washington. There is no fleeing to the safety of the countryside. Vought Tower is the last remaining piece of rendered geometry on planet Earth, and the entities are rapidly converging on its location to aggressively purge the final remaining assets. The isolation is absolute, crushing, and physically suffocating. The massive architecture of the building groans again, this time accompanied by the distinct overlapping sounds of 100 violently distorted audio files playing simultaneously from the lower lobby levels. It is an acoustic tidal wave of pure madness, the heavy rhythmic thud of rigid T-posing bodies sliding aggressively up the marble stairs, the manic, heavily reversed laughter of inverted mechanics echoing up the elevator shafts, the jaunty, unbothered whistling of immortal snipers phasing through the load-bearing walls. The glitches are swarming the foundations, completely ignoring the security grid. Butcher calmly checks the cylinder of his heavy revolver, snapping it shut with a sharp, metallic flick of his wrist. He grabs Marcus roughly by the blood-stained collar, hauling the audio technician forcibly to his feet. There is absolutely no time left for mourning the dead. There is no time for paralyzing fear. If Marcus wants to prevent himself and whatever digital fragments are left of Sarah from becoming a corrupted line of code floating eternally in a gray void, he has to actively guide these intruders to the central broadcast spire at the very apex of the crumbling tower. He has to use the very audio-visual systems he spent his entire life maintaining to artificially hack the failing physics engine of the building itself. Marcus looks down at his trembling hands, realizing with absolute clarity that the survival of his own existence depends entirely on him weaponizing the acoustic architecture of the tower against an enemy made of pure malicious noise. Marcus Lynn's heart has become a cold, heavy stone in his chest, his breathing slowing to a deliberate, calculated rhythm. The terrified, passive observer who cowered beneath the mixing console in the plaza is completely dead, burned away by the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the reality-breaking glitch. He feels a profound, chilling emotional numbness settling permanently over his mind as he looks down at Sarah one last time, knowing with absolute, horrifying certainty that her humanity has been permanently, irrevocably lost to the digital rot, her organic form a permanent casualty of a broken, uncaring universe. He has entirely lost his world, his naive faith in the golden, indestructible gods of Vought, and the very concept of a physical reality existing outside the walls of this failing tower. Hiding in the dark is mathematically impossible. The infinite gray void outside the windows guarantees that retreating is fundamentally not an option. They physically cannot leave the map. The only path left in existence is a desperate, suicidal vertical ascent into the very heart of the corporate machine. He must willingly side with the ruthless monsters who hate Vought to defeat the incomprehensible monsters who hate reality, driving them inexorably toward a final, desperate confrontation in the high-altitude server rooms because the ground floor of reality simply no longer exists. The agonizing ascent up the primary maintenance shaft feels less like a physical climb and more like crawling through the shattered windpipe of a dying machine. Marcus Lynn's hands are torn and bleeding, his fingers desperately gripping the rusted steel rungs as the heavy, suffocating heat of the failing tower presses down upon his shoulders. The acoustic environment inside the vertical tunnel is completely untethered from reality. There is no echo, no natural reverberation of their heavy boots striking the metal grating. Instead, the shaft acts as a massive, corrupted amplifier for the horrors below. Marcus can feel the visceral, bone-rattling vibration of the lower floors systematically deleting themselves. It is a deep, subsonic hum that bypasses his eardrums entirely, rattling the fillings in his teeth and churning his stomach acid. Directly below him, Hughie Campbell is sobbing quietly, a rhythmic, wet sound that constantly skips a beat, his audio lagging slightly behind his physical movements. Billy Butcher brings up the rear, his breathing steady and terrifyingly calm. The suffocating darkness of the shaft is periodically interrupted by the aggressive strobing flashes of missing textures bleeding directly through the reinforced concrete walls. Bright, seizure-inducing squares of neon pink and pitch black violently override the structural integrity of the steel. Marcus has to forcefully close his eyes, relying entirely on the raw, bleeding skin of his palms to find the next rung, terrified that looking directly at the void will blind him. He realizes with absolute, terrifying clarity that they are no longer just climbing a physical building. They are navigating a heavily corrupted data directory, staying just one desperate step ahead of a malicious, world-ending formatting sequence. A sudden, deafening shriek of tearing metal rips through the tunnel far beneath them. It is not the sound of a natural structural collapse. It is the signature high-pitched elasticity of a physics engine rubber band snapping under infinite tension. The sheer acoustic force of the sound wave feels like a physical blow to the chest, threatening to peel Marcus right off the ladder and send him plummeting into the unrendered abyss below. Marcus risks a terrified glance downward between his boots. 50 floors below, the heavy steel doors of the shaft are violently bulging inward, taking on the grotesque, stretched shape of a massive human face. It is the heavy, grinning visage of the minigun-wielding brute, its low-resolution textures stretched completely taut across 10 feet of reinforced steel. The creature's localized audio booms upward, a heavily distorted voice file completely devoid of natural breath. "Pootis Spencer here!" The sound does not travel through the air. It spawns directly inside Marcus's inner ear, a localized pressure spike that makes his vision blur. Butcher reacts with lightning speed, drawing his massive high-caliber revolver and firing 3 blind shots straight down the shaft. The muzzle flashes illuminate the terrifying scale of the drop, but there is no sound of bullets striking metal. There is only a hollow, synthetic ping as the projectiles hit an invisible barrier and simply cease to exist. Butcher curses viciously, his voice devoid of fear but thick with absolute disgust. He grabs Hughie by the collar, violently shoving the younger man upward, demanding Marcus climb faster before the collision mesh entirely gives way. They finally breach the heavy fire doors of floor 95, collapsing onto the pristine, anti-static tiling of the Vought Central Broadcast Server Farm. The temperature here drops violently to a near-freezing chill, maintained by massive industrial cooling turbines that hum with a deafening, monotonous roar. But the natural sound of the turbines is actively fighting a losing battle against a chorus of digital decay. The endless rows of massive black server racks stretching into the gloom are flickering aggressively. Sparks of pixelated light, rendered in sharp two-dimensional sprites, shower onto the floor without generating any actual heat. Marcus drags himself to his feet, his muscles screaming in protest. This is his domain, the absolute beating heart of Vaught's global media empire. From this room, the corporation controls the narrative of every single superhero on the planet. But the physical architecture of the room is staggering. The servers are no longer just processing data. They are violently struggling to render the very floor they stand on. Parts of the ceiling are entirely translucent, revealing a terrifying empty gray void where the sky should be. A sudden, chaotic eruption of human voices shatters the oppressive mechanical drone of the server room. Marcus flinches, spinning around to face the reinforced blast-proof glass doors, separating the server core from the lower executive stairwells. A massive, terrified crowd of human beings is frantically pounding on the thick glass. There are over 200 of them: Vought junior accountants, marketing interns, janitorial staff, and cafeteria workers. They are completely covered in pulverized drywall dust and the blood of their colleagues. Their faces are contorted in masks of absolute primal agony. They are screaming for salvation, begging to be let into the fortified, temperature-controlled sanctuary of the broadcast core. The audio of their desperate pleas is muffled by the thick glass, reduced to a terrifying, chaotic drone of muffled thuds and distorted wails. Marcus feels a massive, suffocating lump form in his throat. These are his people. These are the innocent, low-level cogs in the Vought machine, ordinary humans who never injected Compound 5 and never asked to be trapped in a crumbling, glitching reality. But the true, paralyzing horror is not the desperate crowd. It is what is actively hunting them. Behind the screaming mass of Vought employees, the polished marble hallway is rapidly dissolving into a chaotic storm of pink and black missing textures. The ground is literally unrendering beneath their feet. A group of the anomalous entities has breached the stairwell. 3 identical, rigid foot soldiers, painless cupcakes, are T-posing and sliding effortlessly through the panicked crowd. They do not attack with weapons. They simply slide their rigid bodies directly into the fleeing humans. The moment an entity's clipping mesh intersects with a human being, the results are catastrophically violent and entirely physics-defying. Marcus watches a young woman from accounting get clipped by a sliding soldier. Her body does not bleed. It violently spasms, her limbs stretching 50 feet in opposite directions in a single frame, accompanied by the deafening rapid-fire thud, thud, thud of an infinite collision error. She is instantly transformed into a screaming, vibrating knot of stretched polygons, permanently trapped between solid floor and unrendered void. Marcus sprints toward the heavy control console overlooking the blast doors, his fingers flying across the master terminal. His mind is racing, desperately trying to bypass the corrupted security protocols to unlock the blast doors and let the surviving civilians inside. But the console is violently fighting him. The screens are bleeding red code, the system desperately trying to reallocate memory to keep the top 5 floors of the tower physically existing in 3-dimensional space. Butcher steps up right behind Marcus, his massive, heavy hand clamping down onto Marcus's shoulder with the immovable, crushing weight of a steel vise. Butcher's voice is a low, dangerous growl, completely devoid of empathy or hesitation. He tells Marcus to step away from the door controls. Butcher points a scarred finger at the primary architectural integrity readouts, flashing violently on the main screen. The infection is riding the internal localized network. If Marcus opens those doors, if he lets the physical mass of the infected lower floors intersect with the sterile server core, the entire broadcast array will instantly crash, plunging the final 50 feet of reality into the eternal gray void. Hughie realizes what Butcher is implying and physically shoves the older man backward. Hughie's voice cracks, tears streaming down his face as he points frantically at the terrified faces pressing against the glass. He screams that they cannot just leave 200 innocent people to be stretched into polygon nightmares by a broken physics engine. He pleads with Marcus, begging him to open the doors, insisting that they have to try and save them, that they cannot become the very monsters they are trying to destroy. But Marcus's audio engineer eyes are locked dead on the fluctuating decibel meters of the system's structural integrity. He can hear the deep, groaning frequency of the tower's fundamental code tearing apart. The entities outside are generating too much overlapping acoustic data. They are overloading the server's capacity to render sound and space. If the doors open, the glitch floods in. The absolute, horrifying truth washes over Marcus like a bucket of freezing water. To save the broadcast array, to preserve the only tool capable of sending a reboot signal or exposing Vought to the surviving world, he cannot simply lock the doors. He must sever the connection entirely. Marcus's trembling fingers hover over the master firewall override switch. It is a massive, physical lever designed to completely air-gap the top 5 floors from the rest of the tower's infrastructure in the event of a catastrophic cyber attack. But in this new, corrupted reality, severing the network connection does not just cut the internet. The server farm is actively rendering the building. If he throws the lever, he violently amputates the localized physics engine from floor 94 downward. He will instantly unrender the lower structure. The 200 screaming, terrified people pounding on the glass will not just be locked out. The floor beneath them, the air in their lungs, and the very code holding their atoms together will instantly cease to exist. They will be immediately permanently dropped into the infinite, featureless gray void of deletion. Marcus stares through the thick glass into the eyes of a terrified, bleeding man in a janitor's uniform. The man is mouthing the word, "please." Marcus's mind flashes violently to Sarah, remembering the horrifying digital rot that consumed her. He remembers his own paralyzing fear of the gods, and he realizes that right now, in this room, he is the god holding the knife. The moral absolute of Marcus's entire life fractures into a million irreparable pieces. There is no clean, heroic solution. There is no Superman coming to punch the servers back into working order. If he does nothing, the glitch breaches the glass in 60 seconds, the server crashes, and the entire tower, including Butcher, Hughie, and the broadcast array, is permanently deleted. If he throws the lever, he becomes an absolute, undeniable mass murderer, condemning hundreds of his own innocent colleagues to an eternity falling through an unrendered digital hell. The choice is a violent, jagged pill of pure suffering. Butcher leans in close, his voice a dark, seductively pragmatic whisper over the screaming chaos. He tells Marcus that Vought built this tower on the bones of innocent people. and that tearing it down was always going to require a blood sacrifice. Butcher tells him to stop pretending he's a hero, to accept the bloody math of survival, and to pull the bloody lever so they can burn the corporation to the ground. Hughie is weeping openly now, his hands pressed against the glass, making agonizing, futile eye contact with the doomed civilians, entirely paralyzed by his own helplessness. Marcus Lynn closes his eyes. He does not pray to Homelander. He does not pray to God. He simply listens to the acoustic reality of the room. He hears the agonizing, stretched screams of the civilians being clipped by the entities. He hears the high-pitched metallic whine of the servers dying under the immense strain. He hears the deep, booming, unnatural laughter of the glitches echoing through the structural steel. He realizes that a broken universe cannot be fixed with clean hands. Some must be harmed to preserve the core. With a violent, guttural scream of pure, absolute emotional agony, Marcus grabs the heavy red lever of the master firewall override. He does not hesitate. He rips it downward with all of his remaining physical strength until it locks into place with a deafening, final, heavy mechanical clack. The sound echoes through the freezing server room with the absolute terrifying finality of a guillotine blade dropping. The irreversible step has been taken. Marcus has violently crossed the absolute moral threshold, permanently staining his soul to preserve the machine. He opens his eyes, bracing himself for the immediate catastrophic consequences of his impossible choice. The acoustic reaction is instantaneous and absolutely horrifying. The moment the lever locks, the deafening, chaotic screams of the 200 people outside the glass do not fade away. They are abruptly, violently cut off mid-syllable. It is an unnatural, terrifying audio edit. 1 millisecond there is a cacophony of absolute human terror, and the next millisecond there is absolute, suffocating, dead air. Marcus stares through the reinforced blast window. The marble hallway, the stairwell, the glitching entities, and the 200 terrified men and women are entirely gone. They did not explode. They did not burn. The physical space directly outside the door simply ceases to exist. It is instantly replaced by the terrifying, infinite, flat gray expanse of the unrendered void. The text node graph out of date. Rebuilding floats silently in the vast nothingness directly on the other side of the glass. The air pressure in the server room drops violently, popping Marcus's ears with a sharp spike of pain as the building's localized gravity wildly recalibrates. The top 5 floors of Vought Tower are now a massive severed cube of architecture, floating entirely alone in an endless ocean of dead, gray code. Marcus collapses to his knees on the freezing anti-static tiles, his hands still trembling violently from the exertion of pulling the lever. He stares blankly at the infinite gray void through the glass, his mind completely incapable of processing the sheer magnitude of the slaughter he just committed. He did not shoot them. He did not burn them. He simply pressed a button and erased their fundamental right to occupy space. The guilt is an immediate, crushing physical weight on his chest, a suffocating blanket of darkness that makes it impossible to draw a full breath. He feels the phantom acoustic resonance of their final, cut-off screams echoing endlessly inside the hollow cavity of his own skull. He has saved the broadcast array. He has preserved the physical integrity of the room, but the cost was the total, irreversible annihilation of his own humanity. He looks at his shaking hands and realizes they are completely clean, devoid of any physical blood. Yet he feels more thoroughly stained than Butcher ever could be. The audio technician who spent his life hiding from monsters has just effortlessly deleted more innocent lives in a single second than Homelander has in his entire career. Hughie slides down the wall next to the blast doors, curling into a tight, shivering ball. He cannot look at Marcus. He cannot look at the void. He simply stares at the pristine linoleum floor, completely broken by the absolute ruthless pragmatism of the survival choice. Butcher, however, simply straightens his leather coat, his face a mask of cold, grim satisfaction. He does not offer Marcus any words of comfort or absolution. He simply steps over to the master broadcast terminal, plugging his encrypted flash drive directly into the central mainframe port. The servers hum back to life, their cooling fans spinning up to maximum velocity, stabilized by the sudden massive drop in rendering requirements. The digital infection has been amputated, trapped in the void below. Butcher begins aggressively typing commands into the terminal, preparing to broadcast Vaught's darkest, most horrifying secrets to whatever screens remain functioning in the dying world. He tells Marcus, without looking back, to get off the floor and route the audio channels. The sacrifice is made. The blood is paid. Now they must force the universe to listen to the ugly, dying truth before the final power grid completely fails. Marcus slowly forces himself up from the freezing floor, his body moving with the stiff, mechanical obedience of a dead man walking. The crippling fear of the glitches has been entirely replaced by a profound, hollow emptiness. He walks to the massive mixing console at the center of the room, his fingers trailing over the familiar sliders and dials. He understands now that there is no returning to the normal world, no going back to his apartment, no waking up from this nightmare. The universe is fundamentally broken, and he is a murderer standing on a floating island of servers in an infinite sea of gray. But as he looks at the global broadcast map glowing on the main monitor, showing millions of isolated, terrified people huddling in the dark across the world, a cold, jagged spike of sheer defiance pierces through his overwhelming guilt. Vought built the gods that failed them. The glitches destroyed the physical world. But Marcus Lynn still controls the sound. He places his hands firmly on the master audio faders. He will not die crying in the dark. He will amplify Butcher's catastrophic truth, ensuring the dying universe hears every single ugly note of Vaught's absolute destruction. The master mixing console of the Vought broadcast array is a sprawling, illuminated altar of sliders and dials, and right now, it feels like the control panel of a mass execution chamber. Marcus Lynn presses his heavy, noise-canceling headphones tightly over his ears, desperately trying to block out the oppressive, dead silence of the room. But the absolute silence is a terrifying lie. Inside the isolated circuitry of his headphones, Marcus can hear a faint, impossible audio artifact. It is the looped, heavily compressed echo of the exact moment he threw the firewall lever, the violently truncated screams of the 200 people he just dropped into the digital void. It is a ghost in the machine, a permanent, horrific stain on the system's memory cache. The localized physics engine of the tower could not cleanly delete their raw, organic terror, so it compressed their final agony into a low-frequency hum that vibrates directly against Marcus's eardrums. He swallows hard, tasting copper and ash, his trembling fingers locking onto the master override switches. He does not take the headphones off. He forces himself to listen to the looping slaughter. It is his penance. He needs the agonizing auditory reminder that he has completely forfeited his own soul, ensuring that the monstrous choice he made was not for nothing. William Butcher steps up to the glowing console, his imposing, shadow-drenched silhouette reflecting in the reinforced blast glass that looks out over the infinite gray void. He does not celebrate the successful amputation of the infected lower floors. He simply accepts it as the necessary, bloody cost of doing business. Butcher slams a heavy, scarred finger onto the primary global distribution node on the touchscreen. He commands Marcus to aggressively hijack every emergency broadcast frequency, every remaining cellular network, and every digital billboard left functioning in whatever fragments of the world have not yet been consumed by the glitch. Marcus's hands move with the frantic muscle memory precision of a man who has spent 10 years learning the exact acoustic architecture of the planet. He bypasses the Vought internal sensors, completely overriding the orbital satellite uplinks with a series of sharp mechanical keystrokes. The auditory feedback of the global hijack is immense. A deep, resonant bass drop that physically shakes the floor tiles beneath their boots, followed by the high-pitched, sustained whine of a million carrier waves, synchronizing perfectly to a single localized broadcast point. Marcus is turning the severed floating apex of Vought Tower into the loudest, most undeniable megaphone in human history. The progress bar on the main terminal snaps to 100%, locking in with a sharp, definitive digital chime. The broadcast is violently pushed live. Across the fractured remnants of the globe, every surviving television, smartphone, and smart speaker violently static washes before snapping to Butcher's stolen data feed. Marcus does not look at the visual data. His entire focus is locked on monitoring the global audio return. He hears the simultaneous localized gasps of millions of people as the pristine manufactured illusion of Vought International is violently butchered on their screens. He listens to the high-definition playback of black site laboratory recordings, the agonizing screams of children being injected with pure, untested compound phi. He hears the unredacted cockpit audio of Homelander casually, sociopathically, threatening to laser an entire commercial airliner out of the sky. It is an acoustic tsunami of pure, unfiltered truth, washing away decades of billion-dollar PR campaigns in a matter of seconds. Marcus watches the master decibel meters absolutely peak, completely saturated by the collective horrified realization of a species discovering that their golden gods are nothing more than psychotic, corporate-owned laboratory experiments. Hughie Campbell slowly pulls himself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the master server rack for support. His eyes are wide, glassy, and completely hollow as he watches the live telemetry of the broadcast ripping through the world. The objective they have bled and suffered for, the ultimate destruction of Vaught's empire, is finally happening right in front of him. But there is absolutely no triumph in Hughie's trembling posture, no victorious relief in his ragged, shallow breathing. He looks at Marcus, and Marcus looks back. In that brief, terrifyingly silent exchange, they both acknowledge the horrifying, undeniable reality. They have successfully cured the world of the Vought disease, but they had to nuke the patient to do it. The cost of this truth is the blood of the 200 innocent people Marcus personally unrendered from existence. The moral victory is entirely, completely hollow, buried under the crushing physical weight of the mass murder required to achieve it. Marcus turns back to his glowing console, his face settling into a cold, emotionless mask. The truth is out, but it cannot reverse the digital leprosy actively eating the universe, and it absolutely cannot bring back the woman who pixelated in his arms. Suddenly, a new, terrifyingly distinct frequency bleeds into Marcus's headphones, violently cutting through the global audio feed. It is not the rapid, skipping static of the missing textures, nor is it the looping, cartoonish noises of the glitch entities. It is a raw, physical sound, an organic disruption of the absolute zero-pressure environment outside the blasted windows. Marcus frantically isolates the channel, boosting the external microphones mounted on the tower's surviving comm spire. The sound begins as a low, throbbing rumble, entirely devoid of digital compression, vibrating with the sheer, undeniable mass of a physical object moving at catastrophic speeds. It is the sound of air being violently torn apart, a continuous, deafening sonic boom that rapidly escalates in volume and intensity. The entity approaching is not bound by the lagging frame rates or the missing collision meshes of the infected zone. It is pure, unfiltered kinetic rage, violently displacing the atmosphere as it ascends straight up through the infinite gray void. Marcus's blood turns to absolute ice in his veins. The glitches did not delete him. The god of this world is still alive, and he is coming for the last piece of rendered real estate. High below them, in the endless gray expanse of the deletion zone, Homelander is an ascending missile of apocalyptic fury. When Marcus pulled the firewall lever, unrendering the bottom 94 floors of the tower, Homelander was already airborne, hovering in the sky above the molten crater of the plaza. He watched the physical world simply cease to exist, replaced by the terrifying flat gray floor of the universe's hard limit. But Homelander's flight is not tied to the building's localized physics engine. His propulsion is an inherent, godlike absolute. He completely ignored the deletion of the map, his raw, unadulterated power keeping his physical form completely rendered against the encroaching digital void. Now, stripped of his adoring public, stripped of his corporate empire and completely humiliated by the reality-breaking entities he could not kill, his mind has completely and irrevocably shattered. He is no longer a superhero. He is a rabid, omnipotent animal. The audio feed from the external mics screams in Marcus's ears as Homelander breaches the lower boundary of their floating cube. It sounds like 100 jet engines strapped to a localized hurricane. The physical impact is a catastrophic, world-ending event. Homelander does not land gracefully on the roof. He violently detonates against the underside of floor 95. The heavy, reinforced concrete floor of the server farm heaves upward with a deafening metallic shriek of tearing structural steel. The massive black server racks violently jump 3 inches into the air, crashing back down with a sickening crunch of shattered motherboards and severed power cables. Marcus is thrown violently out of his heavy leather chair, slamming hard into the corner of the mixing console, his ribs cracking under the sheer kinetic force of the impact. The pristine, temperature-controlled sanctuary of the broadcast core is instantly compromised. Emergency red lights begin to strobe wildly, bathing the room in an apocalyptic, pulsing glow. The master decibel meters on the main screen max out entirely, glowing a solid, blinding red as the acoustic shockwave bounces violently off the blast-proof glass. The entire severed cube of the upper floors groans, listing dangerously to one side, its localized gravity struggling frantically to compensate for the massive, furious physical anomaly trying to rip its way through the floorboards. The center of the server room floor abruptly glows a blinding, searing white-hot orange. The ambient temperature spikes instantly, flash-boiling the moisture in the air and filling the room with the suffocating stench of melting linoleum and vaporized concrete. With a deafening, concussive blast of superheated air, the floor simply erupts inward. Homelander rises slowly through the molten crater, hovering 2 feet above the ruined tiles. He is a horrifying vision of absolute, unrestrained destruction. His iconic suit is charred entirely black, melting into his skin. His face is heavily painted with the pulverized dust of the unrendered city, and his eyes are glowing with a brilliant, blinding red intensity that physically hurts Marcus to look at. Homelander does not scream. He does not offer a grandiose monologue about betrayal or power. The terrifying, unnatural silence of his arrival is infinitely worse than his previous tantrums. He simply floats there, a living weapon of mass destruction, slowly turning his glowing, hateful gaze upon Butcher, Hughie, and finally, the massive screens displaying the global broadcast of his absolute ruin. Butcher does not flinch, does not step back. He stands in the pulsing red emergency light, perfectly framed against the infinite gray void outside the window, and flashes Homelander the most vicious, blood-soaked smile of his entire life. Butcher casually taps the glowing screen of the master terminal, showing Homelander the 100% completion bar of the global upload. The god's darkest secrets, his murders, his pathetic manufactured origin, it is all permanently burned into the collective memory of whatever humanity remains. The acoustic tension in the room is unbearable. It is the absolute silence of a drawn bowstring a microsecond before it snaps. Homelander's glowing eyes narrow, the thermal energy building in his skull, emitting a high-pitched whining frequency that makes Marcus's ears physically bleed. Homelander realizes that he cannot unpublish the truth, nor can he punch the digital void outside. The only thing left in the entire universe that he can still physically hurt, the only targets left for his bottomless infantile rage, are the three men standing in the server room and the blinking machines that betrayed him. The thermal discharge is absolute, immediate, and utterly devastating. Homelander violently sweeps his head across the room, unleashing a maximum intensity, continuous beam of concentrated heat vision. He does not aim for Butcher first. He aims directly for the massive server clusters driving the broadcast. The thick steel chassis of the server racks do not just melt, they violently explode, their internal capacitors detonating like fragmentation grenades under the sheer localized heat. The deafening, overlapping crashes of exploding hardware drown out the screaming alarms. A massive wave of superheated shrapnel and molten copper rips through the room. Marcus dives desperately behind the reinforced plating of his mixing console, covering his head as the air above him turns into a searing, lethal oven. The global audio feed in his headphones immediately begins to heavily stutter and artifact, dropping packets of data as the physical hardware running the transmission is violently vaporized. The broadcast is actively dying, the signal physically bleeding to death under the sheer, unadulterated wrath of the fallen god. Marcus's lungs burn with every desperate breath of the superheated toxic air. His hands are covered in second-degree burns from the ambient heat of the console, but his eyes remain locked on the failing audio routing channels on his monitors. The main trunk lines are entirely severed, the primary broadcast nodes reduced to glowing puddles of liquid metal. The signal is failing. The truth is being violently silenced. The ghosts in his headphones, the looped screams of the 200 people he sacrificed, seem to reach a fever pitch, demanding that their deaths have meaning, demanding that the broadcast finish its cycle. Marcus ignores the blinding light of the heat vision tearing through the room. He ignores the terrifying, booming sound of Homelander physically landing on the floor tiles and stepping heavily toward Butcher. Operating purely on the jagged, bleeding edge of adrenaline and sheer, stubborn defiance, Marcus violently rips the primary audio output cables from the destroyed main board. He crawls across the blistering floor, slamming the raw, sparking connectors directly into the emergency analog backup transmitter, desperately bypassing the melted digital processors to keep the signal alive through raw, brute force electrical routing. The heavy analog connection crackles violently to life, pushing a raw, heavily distorted, but entirely unbroken audio feed of the confrontation directly into the global broadcast. Marcus slumps heavily against the base of the backup terminal, his burned hands trembling uncontrollably, his breathing shallow and ragged. His emotional state is entirely, completely devoid of hope. He has fully accepted that he is going to die in this room, violently ripped apart by a god or unrendered by the void. He feels no triumph, only the cold, mechanical satisfaction that he kept the signal alive. The pristine server core, the last bastion of Vaught's digital empire, is entirely permanently destroyed, reduced to a burning, melted graveyard of shattered hardware and toxic smoke. The physical space is actively failing. There is no escape route, no hidden elevator, and no possibility of reasoning with the apocalyptic rage burning in Homelander's eyes. The final violent clash between the architect of the world's misery and the butcher seeking to end it cannot be avoided, and Marcus Lynn is permanently locked in the blast radius, forced to broadcast his own execution to the dying world. The absolute deafening roar of Homelander's heat vision abruptly cuts out, plunging the ruined server room into a suffocating, smoke-filled twilight illuminated only by the aggressive strobing of emergency lights. The god of this world does not fly. He simply walks toward William Butcher, his heavy boots crushing the pulverized remains of million-dollar motherboards into a fine, sparkling dust. The acoustic profile of his footsteps is entirely wrong. It is too heavy, too resonant, echoing like solid iron striking an anvil. Homelander's lips curl back into a terrifying, feral snarl, completely devoid of the camera-ready charm he has weaponized for decades. He lunges forward with a speed that completely shatters the sound barrier inside the enclosed space. The resulting sonic boom violently blows out the remaining intact glass panels of the executive lounge. His fist connects directly with Butcher's chest. The impact sounds like a massive artillery shell detonating inside a cathedral. Butcher is launched backward with catastrophic force, his body violently shattering a reinforced concrete support pillar before crumpling into a broken, bleeding heap among the sparking electrical cables. Homelander does not laugh. He simply breathes heavily, a wet, ragged sound that betrays the sheer, unadulterated panic hiding beneath his omnipotent rage. Marcus Lynn presses his entire body weight against the analog backup terminal, his burned, blistering hands violently gripping the raw copper wires of the audio feed. Every single time his pulse throbs, a wave of nauseating agony shoots up his arms, but he absolutely refuses to let the physical connection drop. He is the last remaining bridge between the horrific truth of Vought International and the dying world outside the gray void. Through the heavy padding of his headphones, Marcus can hear the global broadcast output. It is heavily distorted, laced with the harsh, popping static of the analog bypass. But Butcher's stolen data is still actively transmitting. He hears the looping, compressed screams of the 200 innocent people he personally unrendered, their digital ghosts continuously haunting the sub-frequencies of the broadcast. It is a permanent, agonizing acoustic brand on his soul. He watches Hughie Campbell desperately scramble across the ruined floor, pulling a heavy, vibranium-laced crowbar from the debris of a shattered security locker. Hughie is weeping openly, terrified out of his mind, but he positions himself directly between the fallen Butcher and the approaching god, a pathetic, fragile human shield standing against an unstoppable force of nature. Homelander completely ignores Hughie, swatting the young man aside with a casual backhanded flick of his wrist. The kinetic force is enough to send Hughie spinning violently through the air, crashing hard into a bank of melted server racks with a sickening, wet crunch of breaking ribs. Homelander's glowing, hate-filled eyes are fixed entirely on the massive, blinking oscilloscope of the analog transmitter Marcus is frantically holding together. The superhero's superhearing picks up the faint, rhythmic pulse of the live electrical current. He realizes, with a cold, terrifying clarity, that the broadcast has not been silenced. The global humiliation is still actively bleeding out into the world. Homelander's head snaps toward Marcus, his neck cracking with a sharp, unnatural pop. The sheer physical weight of the god's undivided attention is paralyzing. It feels like standing directly beneath a falling anvil. Homelander takes a slow, deliberate step toward the audio technician. The ambient temperature in the room instantly spikes, the residual thermal energy rolling off his charred suit, feeling like an open furnace. He speaks, and his voice is a low, vibrating hum that bypasses Marcus's ears entirely, vibrating directly inside his chest cavity. You're the little rat keeping the microphone on. Marcus cannot breathe. The suffocating aura of Homelander's absolute supremacy triggers every single primal biological fear response encoded in his human DNA. His knees tremble violently, threatening to give out completely, and his vision narrows into a tight gray tunnel. This is the exact moment he has dreaded every single day of his career at Vought, the moment the god notices the technician and decides to break him. Homelander raises a single blood-stained finger, the tip beginning to glow with a terrifying, concentrated dot of scarlet thermal energy. He tells Marcus to drop the cables, promising a quick, painless death if he complies, and a slow, agonizing surgical dismemberment if he refuses. But as Marcus stares into the blinding red light of his own imminent execution, the paralyzing terror abruptly evaporates, replaced by a cold, hollow, and absolute defiance. He remembers the heavy mechanical clack of the firewall lever. He remembers Sarah's flesh pixelating into nothingness. He has already committed mass murder to keep this signal alive. He will absolutely not let a bleeding, petulant man-child intimidate him into turning it off. Marcus grips the burning copper wires tighter, staring dead into Homelander's glowing eyes, and spits a mouthful of blood and ash directly onto the superhero's charred boots. Before Homelander can unleash the lethal burst of thermal energy, the absolute silence of the infinite gray void outside the shattered windows is violently interrupted. It is not an explosion or a roar, it is a sharp, distinct, high-pitched clipping sound. It is the exact audio file of the no-clip command being activated in a source engine, playing at a deafening, reality-breaking volume. The massive, flat gray expanse of the deletion zone suddenly ripples like water disturbed by a stone. Then, the geometry of the void completely breaks open. They do not fly up from the ground, because there is no ground. They simply phase into existence, ignoring distance and depth entirely. A massive, horrific swarm of entities breaches the boundary of the floating server room. There are hundreds of them, identical, rigid foot soldiers locked in aggressive T-poses, inverted-faced mechanics screaming in reversed audio, and massive, hulking brutes laughing in heavily compressed loops. They do not adhere to the physical boundaries of the blast-proof glass or the reinforced concrete walls. They simply slide through the solid architecture as if it were entirely made of thin air, their bodies violently clipping into the room in a chaotic, overlapping storm of broken textures and flashing pink and black error signs. The acoustic environment of the server room instantly devolves into an incomprehensible, mind-shredding nightmare. The air is entirely saturated with 1,000 overlapping, highly compressed audio files playing simultaneously at maximum volume. It is a deafening wall of digital noise, the metallic clatter of collision errors, the jaunty, out-of-place whistling of snipers, and the terrifying elastic snap of ragdoll physics violently resetting. Homelander whips around, his eyes flaring with absolute panicked rage as the swarm converges directly on him. He unleashes a massive sweeping wave of heat vision, attempting to bisect the closest dozen entities. The searing red lasers pass cleanly through their torsos, but there is no flesh to burn, no blood to boil. The entities simply register the thermal attack with cartoonish, floating red numbers, 999, that pop into the air and fade away. The physics engine of the universe actively refuses to acknowledge Homelander's power. A T-posing soldier slides effortlessly through the blinding heat beam, closing the distance in a single missing frame of time. The entity's unyielding, completely rigid clipping mesh violently intersects with Homelander's indestructible chest. The resulting sound is a deafening, rapid-fire thud, thud, thud as the universe violently attempts to resolve two absolute physical forces occupying the exact same space. Homelander lets out a guttural, agonizing scream of pure, unprecedented physical pain. His skin, engineered to withstand a nuclear detonation, begins to violently tear and glitch under the sheer, impossible stress of the collision error. He tries to fly upward, desperate to escape the swarm, but an inverted-faced mechanic stretches its arm 50 feet across the room, completely ignoring the Z-axis, and grabs him by the ankle. The creature forcefully yanks downward, snapping Homelander back to the floor with a terrifying, instantaneous teleportation effect. Dozens of entities pile on top of the fallen god, their bodies clipping into his limbs, pinning him to the melting linoleum through sheer, unadulterated, graphical overlapping. It is not a fight. It is a violent, systematic deletion of an asset. Homelander thrashes with apocalyptic force, his fists creating massive sonic booms that shatter the remaining server racks, but every strike simply passes right through the glitching monstrosities or results in a hollow, cartoonish bonk sound. His cape is stretched into an infinite, jagged polygon that shoots out the window and disappears into the gray void. The most powerful being in the history of the human race is being slowly, agonizingly dismantled by a relentless swarm of broken code that entirely refuses to play by the rules of reality. From the sparking, bloody wreckage of the collapsed support pillar, William Butcher slowly drags himself into a sitting position. His face is heavily bruised, his ribs are completely shattered, and he is coughing up thick wads of dark blood, but a massive, terrifying grin splits his face. He watches the golden god of Vought being violently stretched, clipped, and tortured by the incomprehensible nightmare they inadvertently invited into the world. Butcher does not care that the floor beneath him is actively groaning, the structural integrity of the severed cube rapidly failing under the immense data load of the entities. He does not care that the entire universe has been reduced to a single floating room in a sea of gray nothingness. To him, the sight of Homelander bleeding, screaming, and completely impotent against the glitch is worth the absolute destruction of reality. Butcher throws his head back and lets out a raspy, blood-choked laugh that harmonizes perfectly with the chaotic, distorted audio of the glitch swarm. It is the laugh of a man who has finally watched the unburnable world catch fire, perfectly content to burn to ash alongside his greatest enemy. Marcus Lynn, however, is not entirely ready to die in the dark. Despite the sheer, mind-breaking chaos unfolding 20 feet away, his audio engineer instincts remain violently locked onto the massive oscilloscope screen of the analog transmitter. Through the chaotic spikes of the global broadcast and the deafening noise of the entities, Marcus notices a terrifyingly consistent anomaly. The glitches are not just random noise, their audio files are tightly bound to a singular, underlying carrier frequency. It is a deep, unnatural digital hum, a fundamental tone that dictates their ability to render within the physical space. It is the very heartbeat of the missing texture virus. Marcus's mind races with desperate, lightning-fast calculations. In acoustic engineering, if you have a massive, sustained frequency, you do not fight it with volume. You fight it with phase cancellation. If he can forcefully sample that underlying digital carrier wave, perfectly invert its acoustic phase, and broadcast the resulting anti-noise at a catastrophic volume through the analog transmitter, he could theoretically create a massive, localized null zone. He could forcefully crash the auditory code, holding the entities together, forcing the universe's physics engine into a hard, immediate reboot. The technical execution of this theory is practically suicidal. Marcus's hands are heavily burned and shaking violently, his knuckles slick with his own blood. He frantically reroutes the primary mixing console, bypassing the melted digital limiters entirely. He isolates the deep, rhythmic hum of the glitch frequency, feeding the raw audio data into the analog phase inverter module. The heavy physical dials of the module resist his touch, caked in pulverized drywall and soot. He pushes the phase shift to exactly 180 degrees, perfectly mirroring the destructive wavelength. But there is a massive, fatal flaw in the plan. The analog transmitter is running on the tower's failing emergency backup batteries. To broadcast a phase cancellation wave powerful enough to blanket the entire floating server room and completely crash the localized physics engine, he needs an instantaneous massive surge of raw electrical power. The tower's main generators were deleted when he pulled the firewall lever, the only remaining source of immense concentrated energy in the entire severed cube is the apocalyptic thermal heat vision currently trapped beneath the dogpile of glitching entities. Marcus realizes with absolute terrifying certainty that he has to willingly draw the attention of the dying god one last time. Marcus grabs a heavy metal broadcast microphone from the ruined console, his knuckles turning entirely white. He routes the microphone feed directly into the room's surviving PA system, overriding the deafening, chaotic noise of the swarm with a sharp, piercing blast of acoustic feedback. He stands up straight, his back to the infinite gray void, and stares directly at the writhing, screaming mass of polygons pinning Homelander to the floor. Marcus takes a deep, ragged breath, filling his lungs with the toxic, burning air, and screams into the microphone with every ounce of physical strength he has left. "Hey, John, is this it? Is this how the great Homelander dies? Beaten to death by a bunch of broken cartoons while the whole world watches on live television?" The sound of Marcus's voice, amplified to deafening levels and dripping with absolute human contempt, slices cleanly through the madness. The psychological strike is flawless. Homelander's massive ego, already fractured and bleeding, violently rejects the humiliation. He cannot allow this insignificant, blood-soaked technician to have the final word. With a roar of pure, unadulterated, universe-shaking fury, Homelander violently forces his head upward through the mass of clipping entities, his eyes glowing brighter than the core of a dying star. Homelander's face is a grotesque mask of burned flesh and absolute psychotic hatred. He completely ignores the entities actively tearing at his limbs, completely ignoring Butcher's mocking laughter. His entire universe narrows down to Marcus Lynn and the blinking analog console behind him. Homelander unleashes a final, desperate, hyper-concentrated blast of raw thermal energy directly at the audio technician. It is not a sweeping beam, it is a solid, blinding pillar of pure, white-hot plasma, carrying the absolute maximum output of his dying power. This is exactly what Marcus was betting his life on. He does not dive for cover. He does not flinch. He stands his ground, staring directly into the blinding light, and violently slams his bleeding fist down onto the master execute button of the phase inverter. A fraction of a millisecond before the heat vision completely vaporizes the console, the concentrated thermal energy forcefully jumps the exposed copper wires, acting as a massive, catastrophic power surge. The analog transmitter absorbs the apocalyptic blast, supercharging the inverted audio signal. Marcus is violently thrown backward by the sheer kinetic shockwave, soaring through the air and crashing hard against the reinforced blast glass, his vision instantly whiting out. The acoustic reaction is not an explosion. It is the absolute, terrifying subtraction of sound. The supercharged phase cancellation frequency erupts from the broadcast array in a massive, invisible, omnidirectional shockwave. The inverted sound wave violently collides with the fundamental carrier frequency of the glitch entities. The resulting acoustic interference is immediate and catastrophic to the corrupted code. The deafening, overlapping noise of the swarm, the metallic clatters, the looping voice lines, the heavy, compressed footsteps, is instantly, violently silenced. The sudden absence of sound is so profound, it creates a painful physical vacuum inside the room. The visual effect immediately follows the auditory crash. The massive swarm of T-posing soldiers, inverted mechanics, and hulking brutes suddenly freeze completely solid mid-animation. They lose their bright, textured colors, instantly turning a flat, wireframe white. The chaotic, clipping meshes stop vibrating. The aggressive, pulsing pink and black missing textures on the walls abruptly halt their violent strobing, freezing into a static, dead pattern. The phase cancellation has successfully crashed the virus. The malicious code is entirely paralyzed, violently trapped in a localized, absolute null state. The heavy, reinforced concrete floor of the severed cube groans a deep, resonant note of relief as the immense physics-defying data load of the entities is instantly zeroed out. The frozen wireframe models of the glitches begin to rapidly dissolve into millions of tiny, glowing digital particles, floating lazily upward like ash from a dying fire before completely fading into the ambient air. The physical space of the server room, while utterly destroyed and bathed in emergency red light, fundamentally stabilizes. The aggressive pull of the infinite gray void outside the windows seems to recede slightly, the absolute boundary of the universe pausing its relentless advance. Marcus Lynn slides down the shattered blast glass, gasping for breath, his ears ringing with a piercing, high-pitched tinnitus. He feels a thick stream of hot blood running from his nose and ears, the physical toll of riding the acoustic shockwave nearly shutting down his internal organs. He forces his eyes open, peering through the smoke and floating digital ash. The nightmare swarm is entirely gone. The room is dead, silent and empty, save for the broken, bleeding survivors. He did it. He forcefully rebooted the localized map. But the true horrifying cost of his actions is a permanent heavy weight anchoring his soul to the floor. In the center of the ruined, smoking crater of the server floor, Homelander struggles to his knees. He is completely unrecognizable. The collision errors and the sheer exertion have stripped away every ounce of his invulnerability. His pristine suit is reduced to charred rags. His skin is heavily bruised, bleeding, and physically sagging. His eyes, once glowing with absolute terrifying power, are dull, hollow, and utterly depleted. He looks down at his trembling, blood-stained hands, completely unable to comprehend the absolute destruction of his godhood. He is just a broken, pathetic man sitting in the ashes of his own empire. From the shadows of the destroyed server racks, William Butcher slowly limps forward. He drags a heavy, jagged piece of shattered, reinforced steel pipe behind him, the metal scraping ominously against the linoleum. Butcher's eyes are wide, filled with a cold, terrifying, and absolute finality. He looks at Homelander, then looks over at Marcus, offering the audio technician a single, slow, respectful nod. Marcus closes his eyes, pressing the back of his head against the cool glass, listening to the heavy, approaching footsteps of the Butcher. The universe is completely broken, thousands are dead, and he is a murderer. But as Butcher raises the heavy steel pipe high into the air above the fallen god, Marcus realizes that for the first time in human history, there are no more gods left to fear. The heavy, rusted steel pipe descends with the sickening, undeniable acoustic finality of a butcher's cleaver hitting a wooden block. There is no grand explosion of cosmic energy, no blinding flash of cinematic light. There is only the dull, heavy, completely mortal thud of metal-crushing bone echoing flatly across the ruined server room. Marcus Lynn does not turn away. He watches with wide, exhausted eyes as Homelander, the indestructible golden god of the American dream, collapses face first onto the melted linoleum. The impact of the superhero's body against the floor lacks any supernatural weight. It sounds exactly like a broken, ordinary man falling into the ash of his own ruined house. The absolute silence that follows is the heaviest sound Marcus has ever experienced in his entire life. It is not the terrifying, artificial dead air of a muted broadcast, nor is it the suffocating vacuum of the digital void. It is the deep, resonant silence of a genuine, permanent ending. The tyrant's heart has stopped beating. The acoustic frequency of absolute fear that has dictated Marcus's existence since the day he was hired has been permanently, violently canceled out. William Butcher drops the bloodied steel pipe. It clatters loudly against the anti-static tiles, rolling a few inches before coming to rest against Homelander's motionless, charred hand. Butcher lets out a long, ragged exhale that rattles deep in his shattered ribs. He reaches into his ruined leather trench coat with a trembling, bloody hand, produces a crumpled cigarette, and lights it. The sharp flick of the lighter and the soft, crackling hiss of the burning tobacco are the only sounds in the room, cutting through the lingering smell of ozone and vaporized copper. Butcher does not gloat. He does not offer a triumphant speech to the heavens. He simply exhales a thick cloud of gray smoke into the emergency red lighting, staring down at the corpse of his greatest enemy with a cold, hollow satisfaction. The war that consumed his entire soul is finally over, leaving him standing in the absolute wreckage of the battlefield. Hughie Campbell slowly limps out from behind the destroyed server racks, clutching his broken ribs, his face streaked with tears and pulverized drywall dust. He looks at Butcher, then at the dead god on the floor, and lets out a shuddering, breathless sob of pure, unadulterated relief. The monsters are dead. All of them. Behind Marcus, the heavy mechanical hum of the analog backup transmitter continues its steady, rhythmic pulse. The global broadcast is still pushing Butcher's stolen data packets out into the surviving world, a relentless acoustic tide of undeniable truth, washing away decades of manufactured corporate lies. But as Marcus stares out the shattered blast-proof windows into the infinite flat gray expanse of the unrendered void, a profound, impossible shift occurs in the atmospheric pressure. The massive, glowing red text reading node, graph out of date, rebuilding, begins to violently flicker, accompanied by the low, resonant hum of a massive hard drive spinning up to maximum velocity. The sound is not the destructive, skipping static of the virus. It is the smooth, foundational drone of a universe reasserting its own source code. The flat gray horizon suddenly fractures. A thin, blindingly bright sliver of natural, brilliant blue sky renders perfectly across the edge of the void. It is not a missing texture. It is a flawless, high-resolution dawn. The reboot wave washes over the severed cube of Vought Tower like a massive, silent exhalation of relief. The suffocating, artificial borders of the quarantine zone instantly dissolve, rapidly rendering the sprawling, devastated, but entirely physical skyline of Manhattan back into existence. The sky fills with the natural, chaotic ambient sounds of a surviving city, the distant wail of emergency sirens, the roar of shifting concrete, and the incredibly faint, overlapping chorus of millions of human voices waking up from a nightmare. The universe has successfully purged the malicious, reality-breaking code, using the massive localized phase cancellation Marcus triggered to reset its fundamental physics. But as the morning sun casts its warm, golden light through the broken glass, illuminating the melted servers and the blood on his hands, Marcus knows the reboot cannot undo the past. The bottom 94 floors of the tower do not magically reappear. The 200 innocent people he dropped into the void are permanently gone, their lives the irreversible, bloody currency paid to keep the broadcast alive and reset the world. Hughie walks over to Marcus, offering a trembling, ash-covered hand. Marcus looks at it for a long moment before taking it, allowing the younger man to haul him up from the floor. Marcus's legs are incredibly weak, his chest aching with every breath, but he stands tall. The terrified passive audio technician who cowered beneath the mixing console is a ghost, burned away in the crucible of impossible choices. Marcus accepts the agonizing, permanent weight of the lives he ended. He will hear their truncated screams echoing in the silence of his mind for the rest of his natural life. He is a monster, a murderer who sacrificed the innocent to slay a god. But as he looks out over the newly rendered, sunlit ruins of the city, he feels an overwhelming, undeniable spark of profound hope. The sky is real, the physics are solid, and the golden, untouchable dictators who demanded perfection are nothing more than rotting meat on the floor. Marcus Lynn limps back to the analog transmitter, his burned fingers resting gently on the master volume fader. He listens to the chaotic, beautiful, perfectly imperfect sound of a godless humanity beginning to rebuild, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he fades the broadcast to zero. The truth is out. The channel is open, and for the first time in his life, Marcus Lynn is absolutely unafraid of the silence.